listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. A new worldwide study has made some groundbreaking findings about obsessive compulsive disorder and its causes, news that's being applauded by the hundreds of thousands of Aussies living with it.
If anyone could spend a couple of minutes in an OCD brain, I really doubt they would ever say things like, I'm so OCD again, for just being, a bit fastidious. It's not something you want. It's like living in your worst nightmare. It really is.
My chat with an OCD advocate and one of the experts behind this global study coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Thursday, the 15th of May.
Morning, Tara, and to you listening. Starting today with politics and the Greens, who today will select a new leader after former leader Adam Bandt lost his seat at the federal election. It's a big deal because the minor party will hold the balance of power in the Senate after the 1st of July. So the party is considering picking 3 leaders to replace Bandt. Some are calling it the Greens throuple. Others might just call it job sharing.
Yeah, and so the favourites at the moment are Senators Sarah Hanson-Young and Maureen Faruqi, but the party is also considering its Senate leader Larissa Waters as well, or all 3, as we heard. Now, the Greens didn't actually have a leader until 20 years ago, Bob Brown being the first, and the party preferred a consultative model of government rather than, say, a leader and followers. Now, the party is doing a lot of soul-searching after losing 3 lower house seats at the last election. It only has 1 MP in the House of Reps, which is Elizabeth Watson-Brown in the Queensland seat of Ryan, and it has 11 MPs in the Senate.
Yeah, and just quickly while we're talking politics, one other interesting result that's come out of this election has been the massive result for the legalised cannabis party.
Yeah.
They received 164,000 votes in their bid for a seat in the House of Reps, almost 30 times what their vote was at the last election. Look, they've still got no seats like they had expected, but honestly, kudos to them. And while we're here, I'm going to shamelessly plug my chat with their New South Wales lead Senate candidate. That was a very, very fascinating chat. And what I found the most interesting is that they consider themselves the only party who do not want to be in politics longer than they have to be. So I'll pop the link to that in the show notes now.
If you tuned in on Monday morning's episode, you would have heard our deep dive that's looking into a new bill seeking to expand abortion access in New South Wales. And that's kicked off pro-life protests attended by ex-PM Tony Abbott and Catholic Archbishop of Australia Anthony Fisher. Well, that bill has now passed the lower house with nurse practitioners, so nurses who have completed advanced nurse training, and registered midwives, one step closer to being allowed to prescribe abortion medication to terminate pregnancies up to 9 weeks across the state.
The Greens MP who introduced the proposed law back in February, Dr. Amanda Conn, told us the reform will put New South Wales in step with other states and follow federal TGA advice. She says it'll give women in the state and the country more certainty.
People who are advocates for women's rights or reproductive rights in New South Wales and across Australia have been really anxious that our rights might be eroded, especially when you look at what's happening in places like the US, where several states have had abortion bans in place that have killed women.
The bill was passed 65-20 and will return to the upper house in the coming weeks to be voted on again before being turned into law.
And we also spoke to Uni of Adelaide law professor Dr. Joanna Howe, who is the lead advocate who was opposed to that bill. Now, she's since taken to Instagram and continued to describe that bill as radical, saying she and her supporters are mourning for the health workers she says were opposed to it. Now, Dr. Howe was yesterday accused by New South Wales Premier Chris Minns and the Leader of the Opposition, Mark Speakman, of using bullying tactics and Americanising our politics, allegations that Dr. Howe denies.
The Bondi Junction stabbings inquest will continue this morning after a tense day in court yesterday involving Joel Couchy's former psychiatrist. The woman, who's being called Dr. A for legal reasons, was seeing Couchy between 2012 and 2020 for his treatment-resistant schizophrenia. The court heard more evidence from Dr. A, who backflipped on controversial claims she'd made the day before that Couchy wasn't psychotic at the time of the stabbing attacks, instead arguing he was fueled by a hatred for women and was sexually frustrated.
Yesterday, the lawyer representing some of the victims' families argued Dr. A's evidence was dishonest, with other experts all unanimously agreeing that it was clear Couchy was floridly psychotic the day of the attack. She agreed that it was conjecture, so speculation or opinion that's not got all the info, and then withdrew it. But she still denied any wrongdoing, including that she helped Couchy wean off his medication that he'd been on for more than 2 decades. And the inquest is going to hear from more witnesses today.
The family of a Queensland man feared to have died in Ukraine is still holding out hope he's alive. Former Gladstone Labourer Caleb List has reportedly been killed while fighting for Ukraine. However, the 27-year-old's body hasn't been found. His uncle Michael Connolly says his worried family last saw Caleb 6 months ago and are desperately waiting for any news.
The platoon has gone back in to retrieve any bodies that may have needed to be retrieved, but they couldn't find any remains in the area. So we don't know what that means.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong says that the government is providing assistance to the family and, like Prime Minister Anthony Albanese earlier this week, is urging other Australians not to go to the war zone.
We all condemn Russia's illegal and immoral invasion, but it is not for Australians to travel to Ukraine to fight.
Now, the news of Caleb's death has come just days after another Australian, Nick Parsons, who'd been volunteering for a bomb disposal charity in Ukraine, was also killed.
Meanwhile, earlier this year, Aussie Oscar Jenkins was also believed to have been killed before the Australian government got confirmation he was being held as a prisoner of war after being captured by Russian forces. He's now facing 15 years in jail in Russia.
And if you're in the market for a personal chef, hairdresser or a masseuse, look no further than Airbnb. The short-term rental booking giant yesterday announced Airbnb services, which it says will allow people to combine their stay with amenities typically offered by a hotel, turning their visit into a hotel-like experience, Chris.
Yeah, the upgrade will be available in 260 cities, including Sydney and Melbourne, with some services like personal trainers available for less than $50. They've also announced Airbnb Originals, which offers exclusive experiences across the globe, like playing beach volleyball in Rio with an Olympian or hanging out with Sabrina Carpenter while on tour. Wow. Okay, of all these offerings, Tara Cassidy, what one got you excited the most?
I mean, none of them particularly, except when you mentioned this kind of star at the end. I would love to go to an Airbnb and have Luke Combs host me.
Oh,
that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if we're going more low-key, perhaps some shampoos and like a makeup session. That'd be cool.
Oh, I love that. I love that there's a little bit of pampering involved for you. For me, I'm just like the allure of a masseuse. Oh, man, getting a massage while on holidays. Yes.
Also, who's getting a PT on holidays?
Oh,
Sorry.
Not me. Yeah, no, definitely not me. And I'm glad to hear not you as well. Finally, we have some agreement this week, Tara Cassidy. Hey, look, that brings our headlines to a close. Up next is your deep dive, looking into this global study that's found one of the main causes of OCD and what experts and those with the condition think about it. Stick around, that's coming up next.
Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. It's a condition that impacts around 500,000 Aussies, and as the name suggests, centres around obsessions and compulsions. But what that looks like for each person can manifest in very different ways. For some, it's around contamination and cleaning, symmetry, order, or perfectionism. Some people worry about harming themselves or the ones they love, while others can't get rid of unwanted and often distressing thoughts. And while OCD symptoms differ, One thing that everyone can agree on is that it can be debilitating, and it's incredibly misunderstood. But now, a new global study is helping to fix that, coughing up new answers on what's actually behind the mental health condition, with researchers finding 250 genes that are linked to it. And that's been welcome news for people like Penny Moodie, an OCD advocate and author, who was diagnosed at 31, despite experiencing symptoms her whole life since the age of about 6. Penny, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing. Can you tell me a bit about what OCD looks like for you and how it's impacted your life?
It's come and gone over the years, or kind of really intensified in some points in my life. As a kid, as an example, I was consumed by the fear that my parents would have a car crash or would die. And so in my head, I had to keep them safe by doing certain rituals before I went to bed. It made me think I had the responsibility of keeping them safe. And as I got older, it kind of changed and morphed into really worrying that I had HIV and AIDS. This was, I was an 8-year-old at the time. I was, washing hands. I would often not want to sit down on toilet seats because I was worried if there was blood, it would somehow get into me. I would ruminate. I would go to my mum for reassurance. So it was really debilitating. But the thing is that no one really knew what was going on. I seemed like an anxious kid. But often when you have OCD, you're really trying to appear okay on the outside, and it can be quite difficult for those around you to know what's going on.
What are some of the things that people often get wrong or misunderstand about OCD? I'm imagining there would be some things that grind your gears.
Yeah, so much. Look, I wish that people knew how debilitating it is. I think it's been classed by the WHO as one of the top 10 most disabling illnesses in the world out of any, illness. And if anyone could spend a couple of minutes in an OCD brain, I really doubt they would ever say things like, I'm so OCD, again, for just being, a bit fastidious. It's not something you want. It's like living in your worst nightmare. It really is. Sometimes they'll see ritualistic behaviour, the compulsions that go on. I think often people don't realise that they're being driven by fear. So they're being driven by the obsessions and the fear and a kind of feared outcome. So people with OCD don't want to be doing these compulsions, and often they're mental, so you won't see them. But I think it's, a really big misunderstanding is that you can kind of turn it on and off, or it's satisfying to do. It's not. It's no one wants to be doing them, but you're worried if you don't, that you feel like you're in danger or that you're a bad person or all sorts of things. So it's really driven by fear.
Now, there's this new study that has found that around 250 genes are linked to OCD, and it's the first time that they've actually been able to specifically locate which ones and which parts of the brain they're impacting the most. How does it feel to kind of finally be able to learn more about this condition that can be, like you said, incredibly debilitating for some people, and get to understand more about what's behind it?
I feel like it's a relief, because I think OCD has been really underfunded, especially when it comes to research and treatment for such a long time. And because it is so debilitating, I think any kind of gains that we see with research that will help in the future with treatment is so welcome and could be a real game changer. I mean, an average of 10 years between onset of symptoms and diagnosis, it's horrendous to think that so many people are suffering for so long. So seeing this kind of research come out, it really gives me a lot of hope.
And it's hoped that this finding will lead to kind of faster diagnosis for people, like you mentioned, a really long time before a lot of people get diagnosed, and to get treatment. And eventually, hopefully, that there'll be more options available as well. What would be your advice to someone who might be at the very start of that journey? They have OCD and might be kind of letting it take the reins rather than the other way around. What would you say?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've met a lot of people who are reluctant to get diagnosed with OCD because they don't want that stigma. And I understand that kind of hesitation, but I think the quicker you can get onto it, whether you've got a kid with OCD or whether you're an adult with OCD, the better you'll be able to understand it. And I think try to learn as much about it as possible. There is more and more out there these days, when it comes to podcasts or books, websites. A good place to start is the International OCD Foundation website, because it's all research-based. I think being able to learn what it is, why it occurs, and how you can treat it is really helpful, not only for you, but maybe for your loved ones as well. And then I think trying to find a psychologist who has experience treating OCD, and particularly with exposure and response prevention therapy, I think would be key as well.
Penny, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today and for coming on the briefing.
No worries. Thanks, Tara.
That was Penny Moodie speaking with me there about her own experience with OCD and her hopes for what this global study could lead to. But speaking to me next is one of the people actually involved in it, Professor Esker Dirks, who's from the QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute, which worked with other researchers around the world and looked at over 50,000 people with OCD. Professor, this study finding these genes linked to OCD is really phenomenal. What will this be able to tell us now?
So we found around 250, but for 25 of them, we have additional evidence that are likely to be causal. So we also have information on where these genes are mostly active, where in the body, and we found them to be active in the brain. And we found them to be quite active specifically in parts that we know are involved in the brains of OCD patients. So that's very important information if you want to develop better treatment for OCD.
And when you say causal, are you saying that we're able to say that this is something that causes OCD, the reason that people get it?
Yeah, so these genes will contribute to causing OCD. That doesn't mean that we found all genes causing OCD. There's probably many more to be discovered, like if we do even larger studies in the future. It also doesn't mean that OCD is purely a genetic condition. We know the heritability, which means like how much of the risk is explained by genes. The heritability is around 30 to 40%. So there's also a large influence for environmental risk factors, and one of them is traumatic experiences. So genes are definitely important, but they're not the only cause.
These three parts of the brain that we were talking about, this study found that the genes are most active in. I think it was the hippocampus, which helps regulate emotions, make memories. Striatum, I hope I didn't butcher that.
Yeah.
Motor control, making decisions, forming habits. And then the cerebral cortex, which is like language, social behaviour, sensors. In what ways do these areas of the brain specifically impact people with OCD?
Yeah, so we know that there's a loop like from the cerebral cortex is what we call the thinking brain. And that's interesting, because obsessive compulsive disorders, people have these obsessive thoughts. So probably that's where the cortex is involved. But then they develop these habits or compulsive actions that they do to reduce anxiety. So there's probably this loop between the cerebral cortex and the striatum that sort of, really hooks people in and makes it very difficult for people to be flexible.
And these genes were also shown to be shared with a number of other mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, anorexia. Can we now conclude that these genes are at least in part the reason people are developing these conditions?
Yeah, well, we know there's definitely sharing the risk genes that we found to be involved in OCD and genes causing anxiety disorders, Tourette syndrome and anorexia nervosa. We know that if you have one mental health condition, that you're also more likely to have another one, to be diagnosed with a second one. So in the clinic, we see a link between the different conditions. And now we found a reason why that is. Like we found that there's sharing of genes and some of the processes that are involved with these different mental health conditions will be shared. Like OCD has a large component of anxiety. So then it makes sense that there's sharing of genes with anxiety disorders.
And how does that change how we treat people for these kinds of conditions? And what do you see the future of treating conditions like OCD looking like, given what we've now learned?
So at the moment, the treatment of OCD involves psychological treatment in combination with medication is found to be most effective. But some people don't respond well to treatment. A lot of people do, and they get better. But some people still suffer from OCD even after treatment. And I think this research will help identify novel treatment targets and novel drugs that can then be used to treat OCD, to help those patients who are not responding to the current treatment. We have these 25 genes now. We found them that are likely to be causal for OCD. We know where they are active. And there's also a lot of information available on which drugs target the activity of these genes. So we can then repurpose existing drugs that target specifically these genes that we found to be related, and then potentially use them to treat OCD. And that's much more effective. Like, it's really expensive to develop a novel drug, but drug repurposing is a much faster way to bring a drug to the clinic because they're already safe to be used. And it might be that there's existing drugs used to treat other conditions that can be effective for OCD, but we don't know about it yet.
Why do you think people wait so long, and often when it's already impacting their life quite a lot, to actually get help and treatment?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of shame. A lot of shame for people with OCD. With a lot of mental health conditions, people feel they have to be stronger. People feel they have to be able to do this on their own. They sort of probably, many people know it's in their head and they think they can change it themselves, and they are really ashamed of sharing what's going on for them when you have these very intrusive thoughts, maybe thoughts about that you might harm someone. It can be really difficult to go to your GP and share what's going on. But this is a disorder like many others, and I would really urge people to seek treatment. And the earlier you seek treatment, the more effective it will be. So don't wait too long. Absolutely. Some sage advice to finish on there. Professor, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing today. Thank you, Tara. Thanks for making time. That was QIMR Berghofer's Professor Eske Dirks, and earlier, author and advocate Penny Moodie, speaking with me about this global breakthrough that's found the genes linked to OCD. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.
Listener.